Every Saturday, a boy called Skelly came to the great cathedral and sat with his mother and father, his sister and the grandparents. His feet didn't quite touch the floor, and there was always someone sitting in front of him so he couldn't see what was happening at the front. Skelly liked going to church in the big cathedral. He liked the coolness. He thought the organ, a pipe organ no less, sounded grand. So grand, in fact, that Skelly felt like a very little person in a very big world. The grandness and bigness and darkness of the cathedral made everyone, according to Skelly, look important and knowledgeable, except for him. The cathedral, as well as being huge and old, had a steeple that stretched far up into the heavens. The idea, Skelly's dad said, was that there would be less of a gap between God in heaven and the people on earth. But that seemed a bit funny, for a tall steeple was hardly going to really get anyone closer to God. Weren't we all still on the ground, not perched up on top of the steeple? The entire front wall was lined with Bibles. The top half of the side and back walls were also lined with books written by people who had gone to their eternal rest. The bottom half, where people could still reach easily, were lined with books still being written by people of every age, from every country. You didn't even need to be a member of the church to add your story to its walls. If you were visiting, you could take a brand new book with its smooth pages and write your own story in it. Along the walls, attached to the special rails on the shelves, were ladders. These ladders could slide along. People were allowed to climb the ladder and choose a book to read. Skelly had climbed the ladder many times, but he'd never taken a book from the shelf to read. He hadn't begun to write his own book, even though he knew everyone else in his family had. Skelly liked touching the edges of the books while he balanced carefully on the ladder, trying to ignore the people waiting below who really wanted to take a book from the higher shelves and read it. "Shall you write a bit of your story?" his mother asked one day, when eventually he crept down from the ladder. She nodded at the stand of blank books that never seemed to run out. "Do you like any of the covers?" Skelly did like some of them. He liked the ones that had weird shapes and bold colours. There was one he especially liked, which was made from soft leather. The creator had etched a soldier into the cover dressed in full armour. The best bits were the helmet and sword. Skelly's fingers had itched to touch the soldier, to feel the smooth carving. He hadn't done it yet because he had this funny idea that if he did, the beautiful book might go away. Best just a look. If only he had a story to tell, a story like all of the others. Then he could make that book his very own. "What is written in your book?" Skelly asked his father one day. "You know," his father said, a bit surprised. "I tell you the stories myself. Every Friday night when the sun goes down, God's blessings to me throughout the week. How I've tried to see people like Jesus would see them. You know, you write those stories in your book? Skelly was astonished. They're the greatest stories I've ever heard. Second greatest, his father said, pointing up. He went to his grandfather. What do you write in your book? He said. His grandfather patted Skelly's head. I write the goodness of the Lord, he said. His patience with old fellows like me and the way he has learned me. Learned you? Yes. I guess today you would say taught me. How has he taught you? Oh, lad, grandfather said, if God had left me to myself, I would be a crabby old man. I start the day reading a few verses from my Bible, and I write down my thoughts. At the end of the day, if I don't fall asleep in my chair, I write down the things I have seen and the things I've done. When I take my eyes off Jesus, even for that littlest while, I write that down too. And later, I can see that God was learning me a bit more so others can see him in me. Wow, maybe it's the greatest story ever told, Skelly said. Second greatest, grandfather said. And like Skelly's father, he pointed up. He asked his mother what she wrote in her book. She took him to the cathedral and took her very own book from the shelf. Its cover was a deep rose, and the pages were filled with tiny, neat writing squeezed all close together with 2 rows of words written on each line. Look, she said, I began writing in this book when I was 18. That is when I found out God was looking for me. Sometimes I write once a day, sometimes twice. Sometimes I will go for weeks without writing in it. I don't worry when I have no words. God knows my story is still growing. So why did you write it all down? He said. Because I want people to know that Jesus is part of my everyday life. The oddest thing happens when I write in my book, Mother continued. I am reminded of the goodness of God all day long. Mine is not the greatest story ever told, Skelly interrupted, but it's probably the second greatest story ever, he said, and he pointed up, even though he wasn't exactly sure why. You do know the greatest story ever told, don't you, Skelly? Mother whispered close. The greatest story is Jesus' story. She pointed to the skies. His story. Oh, he liked the story of Jesus, but he never once thought about it being the greatest story ever told. But now that he had thought of it, of course it was true. You really should start telling your story, Mother said. That way you can have the second greatest story too. Skelly didn't want to say, but he really didn't have a story. Wasn't his life just the most normal life anyone could ask for? There were no big exciting things in his life, and he couldn't possibly write about unimportant things like the school bus being a tiny bit late one day when he was running around trying to finish his homework. His poor head had been shouting, "Help, help," since before he woke up. Could he finish his homework and catch the bus? It seemed that he could. Then there was that terrible moment when he had been small, when he had nearly been run over by a car. He hadn't even turned 2 years old when that happened, and it wasn't really his story, was it? Their neighbour across the road had been the one who had screamed so loud the driver had stopped immediately. That was the neighbour's story and the driver's story. It wasn't his. He hadn't done anything. Maybe that time he managed to write the alphabet without forgetting one single letter might count. It was embarrassing to not be able to read and write as well as the other kids. But he'd really wanted to. And on this day, he had asked Jesus to help him do it right just once. If he could do it once, he knew he could do it again. And that day, he got all the way to Z without one single mistake. His teacher had been so pleased. She hadn't made a big fuss to everyone else, but she looked at him like he'd won a mighty battle and put 3 stickers on his page instead of just a tick. Thinking about the mighty battle reminded Scully of the book at the cathedral. If his story didn't need to be great, if it could just be a little story about something that didn't need to be important before perhaps he could tell the story about writing his letters properly, it would make Jesus look like the kind of person he wanted to know. So he ran all the way to the cathedral, past the rubbish bins and the car parks, the offices and shops. He stood in the church doorway, puffing, and looked toward the front of all the different Bibles. They told his story, Jesus' story, the greatest story ever told. And then he looked at all the books on the lower shelves of the church. Your story, the second greatest story ever told. And then he took the book, the beautiful leather one with the soldier on the front, and sat down to write. My story. He would also tell the second greatest story ever told, whenever he possibly could.